I think we've all played Pokemon. It's a great game. But calling the change between a Pikachu and a Raichu evolution is a bit misleading. To rectify this, let's look at what evolution really is, using Pokemon. First off, evolution is the change in allele frequencies where an allele is a form of a gene. Evolution happens over generations, not in an individual. With that noted, let's look at the factors of evolution: natural selection, mutation, genetic drift, and migration. To understand natural selection, let's look at the lickitung population. There are two phenotypes, long tongue and short tongue. They both eat honey. The long tongue is better able to reach the high-up beehives. This means it has more energy for reproduction. It produces 3 offspring, while the short tongue only reproduces 1. This is the second generation. Again, the long tongues are better able to reach the honey and produce 3 offspring, while the short only reproduces 1. Now we see the third generation. It's clear there is a larger proportion of long than short tongues than we started with, 1/2, now 9 out of 10. Thus, the population has evolved longer tongues. This is the process of natural selection, in which the traits that give survival and reproductive advantages get passed on because organisms with these advantages will reproduce more. Next, let's look at mutations. Mutations are a cause for genetic variation, and the only cause in asexually producing organisms. Mutation is the reason we have different alleles, and thus phenotypes, like long and short-tongued lickitungs, in the first place. Mutation is random and can be caused by environmental factors like UV light or even mistakes in DNA replication. Most mutations don't result in any changes, and even if they do, they have to occur in gametic cells to matter. That's because mutations that occur in sex cells get passed on to the next generation. Now let's consider these 2 Pikachus, one with a black stripe on the tail and one without. Let's assume the stripe has no impact on reproductive ability or overall fitness. In a population of 6, as represented here, by chance only 2 will reproduce. If we randomly pick 2 of the 6 and get these 2, this is what our next generation will look like. Clearly, the next generation isn't representative of the previous generation, and not because of fitness. This is called genetic drift. It's a factor of evolution, and it has a larger impact on smaller populations. To see why, let's look at a larger population. I randomly chose 2 Pikachus from each cluster of 6. These are the ones that don't have a stripe. This means the next generation's population will have a 5 and 18 proportion of unstriped to stripe, which is fairly close to the previous population's 2 out of 6. This shows how random chance and genetic drift have less of an impact on larger populations. Our last factor is migration. Now, migration is pretty simple. Let's go back to these 6 Pikachus. The proportion of unstriped to striped is 2 out of 6, or 1/3. If these 2 Pikachus migrate and join this population, the proportion will now be 4/8, or 1/2. This will change the proportion of these traits in future generations, and thus is a cause of evolution. This has been an overview of the mechanisms of evolution using Pokemon.